Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4, 2021, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Minority Leader.
At this time, I would yield such time as he may consume to my friend from Florida, Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you for yielding to my good friend, Mr. Gohmert from Texas. I appreciate that. Madam Speaker, I rise today to talk about a major problem facing our communities, and that's human violence. You know, I have 4 children, 4 beautiful grandchildren who are school age. And I have to tell you, when I turned on the television set and saw what was going on in Uvalde, Texas, Madam Speaker, my heart sank. I saw my grandchildren in the faces of those children that I saw fleeing from that horrible violence that was being conducted that afternoon. It's too often that we turn on our TV sets and see images of schools locked down and grieving communities. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, we saw that unfold in Uvalde, Texas. Yet every time tragedy strikes, we hear the same conversation: calls for bans on firearms, universal background checks, and red flag laws. That is how we spent the last 2 days in this chamber talking about partisan bills that are, number one, redundant. A lot of these laws already exist. Or number two, they're laws that will infringe on the rights of law-abiding American citizens. And ultimately, they won't fix the problem. Because the problem, Madam Speaker, is not guns, it's not gun violence. The problem is human violence. You know, when I was sheriff, I used to explain to my community occasionally when gun violence, as they would call it, would erupt, and they would ask me to talk about it. And I always made the point, Mr. Gohmert, I would always make the point to them that I could take that weapon off of my hip, put it on that podium, and it would never, ever become violent. Now, some human may come along and pick it up and use it violently, but that's a human violence problem. It's not a gun violence problem. I carried a gun for 41 years. It never became violent. Yet we see it over and over again. Humans are the cause of this violence. It's the cause of the grief that we are seeing today and feeling in Uvalde and Buffalo and so many other cities across America. We see it over and over again. A tragedy happens, a gunman is identified, and what do we learn? Then we learn that they showed all sorts of dangerous behavior and telltale signs of violence long before becoming a mass shooter, a murderer. Killing animals, making threats, threatening words, self-harm, cutting themselves. The list goes on and on. Mental health issues that should have been addressed long before they became an active shooter. But people don't want to talk about that in the wake of a tragedy. The fact is, we already have the tools to deal with these individuals once they are identified. We have the tools to stop these horrific events before they happen. You know, one of the things as sheriff I used to tell my officers all the time, I don't want to be the best first responder to a mass casualty event. I want to prevent it before it occurs. And I saw firsthand countless times when people were a danger, we stopped them before they could hurt others. We put them in jail We arrested them for making threats. We identified them, and we identified the threats that they were making, and we stopped them from acting on those threats. The challenge here, we must focus on identifying those who are a human threat to themselves and others, and then intervene. Too many times after all of these events, we hear that conversation, oh, I knew this guy. I'm not surprised. Those are the conversations that we hear afterwards. We must identify those suffering from severe mental illness and formally adjudicate them so they cannot buy a firearm. That law already exists. We need to start adjudicating those who are mentally ill and a danger. And let me say this, everyone that has a mental illness is not a danger. Many people suffer mental illness and are not a danger. But those that are, we need to adjudicate them as such so that they can't go down and buy a firearm. Those laws are already on the books. But our community must do a better job of identifying those who need help and then get them the services and treatment that they need and deserve. We can do this while also upholding basic due process rights. Our whole judicial process system is based on the assumption that people are innocent until proven guilty. But the ex parte order issued through these red flag laws throws these fundamental rights out the window. Red flag laws take away a person's Second Amendment rights at a lower evidentiary standard without the opportunity to even defend themselves in court. Ex parte is almost a secretive process that's going on without the accused's knowledge. And we see how well the ex parte process worked in the FISA courts, didn't we? The reason our judicial system works is because it's adversarial. We have people on both sides of the issue who are fighting it out in court, discussing the facts. Ex parte, you hear one side of the story. That's all. And they want to use that to take away your Second Amendment rights. Then once deprived of those rights, now we have to prove that we're innocent. This is backwards and ineffective at solving our violence problem. Before we quickly jump to pass bad legislation like we just passed this afternoon, let's do a better job of enforcing the laws that are already on our books. Before we rehash the same talking points and debate partisan messaging bills, let's work together on the areas where we need change. Let's work together to bolster our mental health system so we can better identify people suffering from mental illness and adjudicate them if they are a danger and provide them the treatment they need and deserve. Let's work together to strengthen penalties for those who steal and traffic in firearms. Let's work together to secure our schools and make sure that our kids have a safe place to learn. The Stop School Violence Act of 2018, which was signed into law by President Trump. When we drafted the language for that bill, the first concern that I had was identification of those who are a threat. And that's the first part of that bill. The second part of that, or law, the second part of that law now is CPTED, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, how we can stop those who may be coming to our schools to commit violence. Let's work together to identify the signs of dangerous behavior and prevent these acts of violence before they even happen. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back. And thank you, Mr. Gohmert.
Thank the gentleman. And I know my friend mentioned he'd been a sheriff, but he has great expertise in knowing what he's talking about, and I appreciate those insights from a lawman. And now it's my pleasure and honor to yield to someone from West Texas, ambassador from Texas Tech University, where their slogan is guns up, not because they're violent, but I've always taken it to mean they were ready to preserve and protect if the need arose. And so yield such time as he may use to my friend, Mr. Arrington.
Well, I've never been more proud to be a Red Raider after that introduction. I can tell you that. I thank the gentleman and my fellow freedom-loving Texan, Representative Gohmert. We will miss you in this chamber and the fight that you brought every day for the people in this people's house. I wanted to lend my thoughts and sentiments on this issue of violence. As my colleague from Florida mentioned, human violence, sometimes perpetrated with guns, and a human problem, a problem of the soul, a problem of society, the degradation of our culture and our families. These are issues far deeper than legislation can reach, I can assure you. And I understand, because I'm human, that we want to do something, and that while that may be a human response, as lawmakers, we should ask the question, not can we do something symbolic? Can we do something to make the American people feel good? Because that's not going to save a single elementary school child. We have to ask the question, what can we do that will actually work? And what can we do that will also preserve the rights of our citizens to protect themselves? I think, Mr. Gohmert, we often forget and fail to start this conversation with the genesis and the fundamental rationale for the Second Amendment. Our founders knew good and well the abuses, the corruption, and the tyrannical forces from a coercive central government. And they wanted to make sure that not only could we preserve our happiness and our life and liberty from the crazy and the criminal, they wanted to make sure that we would have a last check on tyranny with an armed citizenry. Folks, the Second Amendment is there, and we have preserved this experiment in liberty and democracy for 240 plus years. Even though in the 20th century alone, tens of millions of people have been slaughtered by their own government, we have preserved this great beacon of liberty, this shining city on a hill, because of that founding principle that the Second Amendment is the citizen's last check on an abusive government. The Declaration of Independence says it best. It talks about the mission of a government that has the consent of the people to protect and secure the liberties of those people. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. But it goes further. It says when there's a long train of abuses and usurpations, reducing the society to absolute despotism. It is the right and even the duty of the people to throw off that government. Folks, that's the context to the Second Amendment. It's not just to give East Texans and West Texans a hunting license. And I think it's critical as we grieve with our brothers and sisters in Uvalde, and it is heartbreaking and unthinkable to see that tragedy play out and to see these families suffer. But I think it is incumbent upon mature lawmakers and leaders of the greatest and freest country in the world to take a deep breath and ask the question, will these things that we're talking about with respect to gun control actually do anything to stop these crazy, murderous people from committing their crimes? We need to let Uvalde grieve. We need to let the final report come out. We all need to be more vigilant. And quite frankly, when we talk about 18 to 21-year-olds and extreme risk orders and all the litany of things that are being debated in this chamber, we ought to let the states like Texas, along with their communities, figure out how to solve these problems and secure their schools and communities. The federal government's mission at its core is to secure the liberties of the people and provide for a common defense. Let Texas figure this out. My goodness, the very gun control laws that were passed out of this chamber have been in place in cities and states with the highest gun-related crimes. No more feel-good measures, no more infringing measures. Let's pray for Uvalde. Let's let Texas solve those problems, and let's protect the God-given, constitutionally protected rights of every American to defend themselves against the criminal and, God forbid, a coercive government. God bless America, and I want to thank the gentleman for Texas for the indulgence, and I yield to my friend.
I appreciate the wise observations, my friend from Texas. It couldn't have asked for a better lead-in to the thoughts that I had on this very issue. Mr. Arrington has some great insights. I have an article here from all things ABC News. And above the name of the author, Bill Hutchinson, is a quote from a police official that it's worse than a war zone around here lately. The article says at least 12 major U.S. cities have broken annual homicide records in 2021, and there's still 3 weeks to go in the year. This is from December 8th of 2021. This article became more relevant because of the horrors that occurred in Uvalde. Another quote from Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney, quote, "It's terrible to every morning get up and have to go look at the numbers and then look at the news and see the stories. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. And this needs to stop." But he said that after a city surpassed its annual homicide record of 500, which had stood since 1990. Philadelphia is a city of roughly 1.5 million people, has had more homicides this year. This is 2021. 521 actually as of December 6th. Then the nation's two largest cities, New York, which had 443 as of December the 5th, And Los Angeles, 352 as of November 27. That's an increase of 13% from 2020, a year that nearly broke the 1990 record. So the article goes on and talks about all these shootings in our major cities. And in fact, and these aren't considered mass shootings. They don't meet that definition commonly used. But from worldpopulationreview.com, the top 10 cities in the United States with the highest murder rates, and that's murders per 100,000 people. Number 1 is St. Louis. Number 2, Baltimore. Number 3, New Orleans. Number 4, Detroit. Number 5, Cleveland. Number 6, Las Vegas. Number 7, Kansas City. Number 8, Memphis. Number 9, Newark. And number 10, Chicago. Now, all of those have Democratic mayors. Las Vegas has an independent who was a Democrat until 2009 when when the mayor announced now being an independent. But we also, in 2021, had 16 cities hit record high homicide rates. Rochester, and again, rates normally are calculated in murders per 100,000 people. But Rochester, New York had 80. Philadelphia had 524. Louisville, Kentucky had 179. Baton Rouge had 115. That was an unofficial number, but apparently accurate or close to accurate. Austin had 88. Indianapolis had 258. St. Paul had 35. Portland, Oregon had 84. Albuquerque had 107. Tucson had 92. Columbus had 179. Jackson, Mississippi had 129. Atlanta, Georgia had 150. New Haven, Connecticut had 25, which is a tremendous number for a small city. Macon, Georgia had 52. Milwaukee had 190. Additional cities with high homicide rates, naturally Chicago had 797 homicides in 1 year. And yet, Mayor Lightfoot, prominent Democrat that she is, doesn't want to get to the root causes of that. Black Lives Matter. There is absolutely an inordinate number of black lives that are taken in these Democrat-controlled cities. New York had 481. It's just tragic what has gone on. So what's different? We've had guns in America. In fact, not only have we had them from our founding, if it were not for guns in America, we would not have had a founding, starting perhaps with Lexington Green. But people in America had guns, and they defended themselves, and they defended their liberty. That's how we came to have what I believe is the greatest country in the history of the world. And I know there's a lot of schools that are teaching how terrible this country is, But I hear over and over from people that come here to the United States from other countries, and they say, you have got to protect your freedom, because if you lose your liberty, your freedom here in America, there will be nowhere else in the world anyone can go to be free. Historically, countries don't go fight for other people's freedom, yet this country has. We fought the bloodiest war with the biggest loss of life here on our own soil for the freedom of people who were slaves. And yes, I know states' rights were a big part, but let's face it, slavery was at the bottom of it all. Countries don't do that. This one did. You even had the founders do something that founders don't do historically. They condemned themselves in their own founding documents by saying all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Heck, Thomas Jefferson himself put the grievance in the Declaration. There was disagreement on it, but here he was, a slave owner, and yet the most offensive, longest paragraph of the grievances was because King George had allowed slavery to ever start, and the problems of the wrong that was being done through that institution. It was wrong. And yes, I know it's always been here on earth. And as I understand, there may be 40 million or more people in slavery right now today in our modern world. But it doesn't make it right anywhere, and it needs to stop. And this country had people who were founders that condemned themselves by putting that language in there because they knew what was right. This is an unusual country. And I know Solomon's Israel was an absolutely amazing place. Supposedly the wisest man to ever live. Of course, till he had so many wives, and that creates problems. But more opportunities, more liberty here than anywhere. And yet, we've spent the week hearing over and over about the need for gun control. First time I was asked if I supported gun control years ago, I said, well, of course I do. We were taught in the Army that the most effective gun control back then, I believe there were the 8 steady hold factors, the best way to control your gun while firing. The steady hold factors, we were taught. They don't teach that in the Army anymore, as I understand it. But kids have grown up around guns in America, and we didn't have mass shootings. So there's something going on here. And I know I was condemned roundly this week, yesterday, talking about we had friends across the aisle who made clear they didn't want to hear any more about prayer. They wanted to do something. Didn't seem to care if it was wrong. They wanted to do something. Well, John Lott Jr. had this article May 26 in Newsweek, and just touching on certain parts, he said, just as with so many of these attackers, talking about the shooter in Uvalde, he said, the man who attacked Robb Elementary School picked a place where people were banned from carrying concealed weapons. For example, the perpetrator of the Buffalo shooting from a couple of weeks ago wrote in his manifesto, quote, areas where carrying with a concealed weapon are outlawed or prohibited may be good areas of attack. He put that in the manifesto in case people just were too dense to understand that it draws shooters if they know they've got soft targets. John Light says teachers and staff can carry concealed handguns in about 30% of Texas school districts. So we don't need to guess how the policy would work. 19 other states also allow concealed carry in schools. Since the year 2000, there is yet to be a single case of someone being wounded or killed from a shooting, let alone a mass public shooting, between 6 a.m. and midnight at a school that lets teachers carry guns. While there have not been any problems with armed teachers, the number of people killed at schools without concealed carry has increased significantly over the course of the last decade. Biden's speech Tuesday night contained one misleading or false statement after another. Instead of trying to bring the country together, it politicized the attack. When mentioning the Sandy Hook, Parkland, Santa Fe, and Oxford school shootings, Biden claimed that there were 900 instances of gunfire at schools over the last 10 years. But someone committing suicide in a car parking lot at 2 a.m., two at schools or two gangs fighting over drug turf in a parking lot after school hours, and an accidental discharge in a firearms training class are not remotely similar to the sort of shooting that happened on Tuesday. Even including lone suicides, accidental discharges, including those by police, and gang fights, the number, as compiled by my organization, the Crime Prevention Research Center, is about half of what Biden claims it is, 470. Since 1998, there have been a total of 9 attacks similar to the Robb Elementary School shooting. 9 is 9 too many. Once you adjust for population, there are many other countries, from Germany to Russia to Finland, that have comparable rates of school shootings. Biden says we need common sense gun laws, but what he proposes simply will not help. He doesn't seem to realize that over 92% of violent crime in America has nothing to do with guns. Focusing on so-called assault weapons is not only not going to stop mass public shootings, but it won't make a difference in reducing murders at large. Only a small share of murders, and again, one's too many, but a small share of murders are committed with rifles, let alone so-called assault rifles. And that share has grown even smaller over time. The percentage of firearm murders committed with rifles was 4.8% prior to the federal, quote, assault weapons, unquote, ban that took effect in September of 1994. When the ban was in effect from 95 to 2004, the figure stood at 4.9%, up 0.1% with the so-called assault weapons ban in effect. But since 2004, it's been even lower. Based on these numbers, it's hard to argue that the ban did anything at all. Biden claimed, quote, when we passed the assault weapons ban, mass shootings went down. When the law expired, mass shootings tripled. In fact, there was no drop in the number of attacks with assault weapons and virtually no change in total mass shootings during the 94 to 2004 ban. And, we know from the rules of the House, can't say anybody lied, including the president. But whoever's putting those words in his teleprompter sure was, because that just didn't happen. He misrepresented the truth. I'm sure not intentionally. Biden asked Americans why people need assault weapons to hunt deer, but in reality, many so-called assault weapons are nothing more than small game hunting rifles. The AR-15 platform has just been made to cosmetically resemble a military-grade weapon. But for people that know weapons, it fires a .223 round. It's just 300, or actually 3,000ths bigger a round than a .22. Now, we were taught in military science, and had an Army scholarship at Texas A&M, that Vietnam, they'd gone to the M16, now the M4, same basic gun, but it fires the same size round, or in the metric system, 5.56. But we were taught that, gee, it's a higher speed, but the rounds are lighter weight, therefore our military can carry more of them. But we were also taught it's certainly not more lethal than what was being used before with a 7.62 round, or .762 round. The Uvalde tragedy, John Lott says, will inevitably lead to a push for so-called red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders. You would never know this from the media coverage, but the federal government and every state already have laws on the books that deal with people who are a danger to themselves or to others. These laws are commonly known as Baker Act statutes, though they go by different names in different states. They typically allow police, doctors, and family members to have someone held for a mental health examination based on a simple reasonableness test, effectively amounting to an educated guess. Further down, when faced with legal bills that can easily amount to $10,000 for a hearing, few people find that it makes sense to fight a red flag law just to keep their gun. Judges will thus initially confiscate a person's gun on the basis of a written complaint and, quote, reasonable suspicion, unquote. When hearings take place weeks later, courts overturn a third of the initial orders, but since few defendants have legal representation, the actual error rate is undoubtedly much higher. When people pose a clear danger to themselves or to others, they should be confined to a mental health facility. If someone is really suicidal, simply taking away his gun won't solve the problem anyway. If anything, red flag laws harm people who need genuine help. Absent such laws, a person contemplating suicide might speak to a friend or a family member and be dissuaded from that tragic course of action. It's well past time that we address these mass public shootings, but let's come up with proposals that matter, starting with elimination of gun-free zones. It also is worth noting, although some say assault weapons ban would reduce mass shootings, and they think that an assault weapon would be an automatic weapon. Hear that over and over. And actually, automatic weapons are already illegal and unavailable to the general public. Assault weapons are only available to the military. Though you have people that are vying for gigs on CNN or MSNBC that may say otherwise, but people that actually don't have an ulterior motive, they know an AR-15 is most often used as a defensive weapon, and why I have heard more people like an AR-15 with such a small round as a defensive weapon at home is people that don't fire weapons often, they end up twitching before the gun is fired, which is extremely harmful to the accuracy. The AR-15, because the round is so small, it doesn't have much of a kick at all. And so people not used to using guns actually can be more accurate and find it more helpful. We have people here saying you shouldn't have more than 5 rounds, yet if you have multiple people coming into your home threatening your family, and they will each have guns most likely, you need that. Of course, I had a guy last time, some years back, when there was talk by Democrats about eliminating or making illegal multiple rounds in a magazine. I had a guy told me over in Rayburn, he said, hey, I know y'all are looking at banning multiple rounds in a magazine, and I'm from Georgia, and we don't want that because we find that it, generally speaking, takes over 50 rounds to bring down a drone. I thought he was kidding, but he didn't smile. So that was news to me, and the only time I've heard that request for multiple rounds in a magazine. But the assessment of the federal assault weapons ban, impacts on gun markets and gun violence, 1994 to 2003, the Department of Justice concluded this, quote, should it be renewed, the ban's effects on gun violence are likely to be small at best and perhaps too small for reliable measurement. Assault weapons were rarely used in gun crimes even before the ban. According to recent data from the FBI, between 2015 and 2019, you are twice as likely to be killed by hands or feet than you are to be killed by a rifle. That's really amazing and shocking. But our society, if you go back to Supreme Court case in the late 1800s, they reviewed pages and pages of evidence and said they didn't think there was any question that the United States was a Christian nation. Not that everybody in the United States was a Christian, of course not. Never has been. But that Christian, Judeo-Christian principles had a major effect on our founding and on the country up through those times. I would agree with President Obama when he said, we are not a Christian nation. I think the Supreme Court was right back in the late 1800s, and I think President Obama was right when he says we're not now. So what is the answer? Well, what's amazing to me is we have people concerned, deeply concerned, and I have friends across the aisle, and I know their heart. I know how desperately concerned they are about these shootings. They want to stop them. But if you look at the data, you look at the cold, hard facts, the number one state in the nation for gun control laws is California. This article from A.R. Hawkins from June 5th, 22. An FBI report on active shooter incidents in 2021 shows that California was the number one state for such incidents, with 6 incidents total. California is also number one for gun law strength. the Mike Bloomberg-affiliated Everytown for Gun Safety noted. According to the FBI, there were 61 active shooter incidents across the country in 2021, and 12 of the incidents met the definition of mass killing. California, where our speaker is from, led the nation with 6 of those 12 active shooter incidences. California has universal background checks, assault weapons ban, high-capacity magazine ban, 10-day waiting period on gun purchases. They've got the red flag laws, the gun registration requirements, the good cause requirements for concealed carry, a ban on carrying a gun on a college campus for self-defense, a ban on K through 12 teachers being armed on campus, a background check requirement for ammunition purchases, and a limit on the number of guns a law-abiding citizen can purchase in a given month, among other controls. Additionally, ammunition purchases are only allowed if made through a state-approved vendor. And yet, as a friend mentioned at the beginning of our hour here, you've got more shootings in Mexico. This article from American Wire by Melissa Fine indicates that according to National Shooting Sports Foundation, retail surveys revealed a 58% increase in gun sales to African Americans, a 49% increase among Hispanic Americans, and firearm sales to Asian Americans jumped by 43%. Further into the article, it says, as a Mexican immigrant, this is a guy named Juan Romero, he said, and he had immigrated from Mexico as a teenager, but he says, I feel people are waking up. He legally immigrated to the United States when he was 13. He said the Second Amendment is a large reason why people feel safer here in the U.S. and in their homes at night. He said as a kid, of course, living in Mexico, I knew what it was like to feel helpless. Nobody wants that feeling. I saw my mom and grandmother go through struggles, feelings of fear in our small Mexican town. It was difficult. But after moving here to the U.S., it's a new world. I go to bed with no worry about defending myself and my family because he and the family have guns. So what makes a difference? You know, we heard in our hearing in judiciary from some Democrats, they didn't want to hear us attribute any effect to social media. They didn't want us to attribute any effect to violent video games or to Hollywood or to mental illness or to godlessness or to fatherlessness or to drug use. Yet, we need to talk about these things. We really need to talk about these things. We were told they didn't want to hear anything more about prayers. And I know some media has made a big deal of that, but the fact is, before prayers were eliminated in schools, we didn't have the kind of mass shootings we do today. And I read a quote from a man named A.A. Hodge back before the turn of the century in 1900. In fact, it was a few months before his death in 1886. Jim Garlow had quoted this, Reverend Hodge. He was the principal of the Princeton Seminary, professor of systematic theology, And he warned a few months before his death, quote, "I am as sure as I am of the fact of Christ's reign that a comprehensive and centralized system of national education separated from religion, as is now commonly proposed, will prove the most appalling engineering for the propagation of anti-Christian and atheistic unbelief and of antisocial, nihilistic ethics, social and political, which this sin-rent world has ever seen." You know, George Orwell commented, "Sometimes the first duty of intelligent men is the restatement of the obvious." He said, "The further a society drifts from truth, the more it will hate those who speak it." I'm getting a lot of hate. The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. We're getting a lot of that in this country. Eliminate our history, lie about our history, tear down our history and our statues. When the truth is, you learn from good history and you learn from bad history, and if you don't get all of it, or you get inaccurate history, you don't learn anything accurate. Orwell said, "Free speech is my right to say what you don't want to hear." He said, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." But as he talked about history and the ministry of truth that rewrote history every day, like a disinformation board, he said the past was erased, the erasure forgotten, and the lie became the truth. We've seen a lot of that, and not from Republicans. Orwell said, "So much of left-wing thought is a kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot." He said, "Threats to freedom of speech, writing, and action, though often trivial in isolation, are cumulative in their effect, and unless checked, lead to a general disrespect for the rights of the citizen." He said, "Whoever controls the image and information of the past determines what and how future generations will think. Whoever controls the information and images of the present determines how those same people will view the past. And he who controls the past commands the future. Who commands the future conquers the past." Orwell defined journalism as printing what someone else does not want printed. Everything else, he said, is public relations. We got a lot of public relations in this town. From the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn had an interesting quote. He said, "Remember Lenin's words, an oppressed class which did not aspire to possess arms and learn how to handle them would deserve only to be treated as slaves." That's Lenin. And the system he created in the Soviet Union resulted in the second most murders by government in the history of the world, second only to Mao Zedong in China. Whittaker Chambers, I waited too many years to read his book, Witness. But he says, because he did a lot of analysis. He was an atheist. He'd had a troubled family life and loved the idea of communism, but eventually saw what communism really was and decided he didn't want any of it, eventually became a Christian. But he said the moment man indulged his freedom to the point where he was also free from God, it led him into tragedy, evil, and often the exact opposite of what he had intended. In human terms, there was no solution for the problem of evil. He said the crisis of the Western world exists to the degree it is indifferent to God. It exists to the degree in which the Western world actually shares communism materialistic vision, is so dazzled by the logic of the materialist interpretation of history, politics, and economics that it fails to grasp that for it, the only possible answer to the communist challenge is to choose either faith in God or faith in man. Well, what Lenin had to say about that issue, he said every religious idea of God, even flirting with the idea of God, is unutterable vileness. And that came after Dostoevsky analyzed what this crazy guy named Marx had to say. And Dostoevsky took great issue with it. And at one point, he said, Dostoevsky, the problem of communism is not an economic problem. Of course, some of us know it is an economic problem, but his point is it's not the biggest problem. He said the problem of communism is the problem of atheism. And back during the summer, I was an exchange student to the real Soviet Union in the 70s. It was nauseating to walk into a church and where you would have seen a gorgeous stained glass window of Jesus. I remember one came in, and I've seen picture depicting Jesus surrounded by the children where the quote was, suffer the little children to come unto me, except it was Lenin sitting there with the children around him. They had destroyed the stained glass of Jesus and had Lenin, which goes back to what Dostoevsky had to say. The problem of communism, socialism, progressivism, the big problem is ultimately government has got to be God. And that doesn't work out well. Natan Sharansky, an amazing man, he said a lack of moral clarity is why people living in free societies cannot distinguish between religious fundamentalists in democratic states and religious terrorists in fundamentalist states. That's why people living in free societies can come to see their fellow citizens as their enemy and foreign dictators as their friends. A lack of moral clarity, and that's not being taught in too many of our schools. Ronald Reagan told the Alabama legislature in 1982, to those who cite the First Amendment as reason for excluding God from more and more of our institutions in everyday life, may I just say, the First Amendment of the Constitution was not written to protect the people of this country from religious values. It was written to protect religious values from the governmental tyranny. John Adams said the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. He wrote this to Thomas Jefferson toward the end of his life. Adams said, I will avow that I then believed and I now believe that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God. And I've gotten mail before saying, how dare you bring these things up on the House floor? Because people are not taught our history. The fact is, the Bible has been quoted more times, many, many times more than any other book throughout our history, but it's quoted less and less these days. We've got our work cut out for us. But it appears the Supreme Court is starting to understand for them to become oligarchs, monarchs, and rule from Mount Olympus across the street here is not the best way to decide things. Better left for the legislature after great debate. And that's what we need to do. And we really need to look at what is different now than when we didn't have mass shootings like we do now. And I think we'll come to the things that Nathan Sharansky, Whittaker Chambers, Dostoevsky, John Adams, Ronald Reagan, and so many of our founders understood. And with that, I yield back.